Turn it up. Look, 100 years after 100 years, they done lied to us about this and that. Told us all we from Africa. I made fiction characters turn into facts. Heard you tell me then it was not. Knowing goddamn well that trick was capped. My wife and I wrote a book about it. It's a book with knowledge, evidence, and fact. And my other book got them haters shook, cause it's helping mind people take a closer look at their backgrounds in the background, showing my people where they supposed to look. Showing my people where they get it from, where they hit it from, all sorts of angles. When it comes to this research, you must please first, don't trust strangers. Find out all on your own is what I highly recommend and suggest. And if you looking for answers and content about me, I highly recommend you the best, which is my website at the link you see just across the screen. Don't let it miss you. I make it simple. I double down on that black and white. It's too official.
English is defined as being related to England or its people or language, but it's also defined as a spin given to a ball, especially in pool or billiards. And the description of a pool is defined as a body of persons available for work. So it wouldn't be hard for one to imagine that these same persons available for work are being pooled together to accumulate a fund of money for someone else's disposal, which is also the definition of a pool, a fund of money that will continuously be paid to those who successfully trick an entire group of people out of their own inheritance. And by the way, this is similar to sports betting. The race, it seems, was a race to see how efficiently one can put a spin to the great presumptuousness of a group of people who are deemed to have an exaggerated sense of importance. You teach them English or their form of English. English is a bridge language that uses all of the wrong words of a particular language, because English does not define a particular people or its language, as English has several dialects, meaning that each group of people can have their own English. There's British English, American English, Caribbean English, Indian English for speakers of English in the East Indies, China English, and the list goes on. But the particular type of English which is spoken by many so-called African Americans in the United States is called African American Vernacular English, formerly Black English Vernacular. According to Britannica, African American English is a language variety that has also been defined at different times in dialectology and literary studies as Black English, Black dialect, and Negro non-standard English. Since the late 1980s, the term has been used ambiguously, sometimes with reference to only Ebonics, or, as it is known to linguists, African American Vernacular English, and sometimes with reference to both Ebonics and Gullah, the Creole spoken by African Americans in coastal areas of South Carolina and Georgia, and on the offshore sea islands. In the 20th century, much of the scholarship of AAE revolved around questions on how extensively it was influenced by African languages and whether it is in fact an English dialect, an archaic survival of the colonial English spoken by indentured servants on the plantations of the North American Southeast, or a descendant of the 17th century West African Pidgin language." End quote. It also goes on to say that there is a possibility that a form of decreolization has taken place within the language spoken in this part of America, as decreolization is the process by which a vernacular loses its basilectal or Creole features under the influence of the language from which it inherited most of its vocabulary. The basilect is the variety that is the most divergent from the local standard speech. The consensus among linguists is that Ebonics is an American English dialect, differing from other dialects primarily in the higher statistical frequency of non-standard features, such as the merger of hasn't, haven't, and isn't, aren't, even didn't, don't in the case of Ebonics, in the form ain't, and the omission of copula in constructions such as Jesse very tall, Jesse's very tall. The latter features makes Ebonics typologically closer to Gullah and Caribbean English Creoles. It has therefore been interpreted by some linguists as evidence that Ebonics must have Creole origins. No consensus has been reached on the issue. End quote. Now, I think it is important to note here that the American English spoken in the southeastern parts of America, with the different inflections of tone and tongue, and also pertaining to words spoken, has confused many linguists that have chosen to not acknowledge the American Indian contribution to the language. And instead of stating it as such, they have chosen to group the title of Ebonics to the people for their language, when in America, Ebonics isn't held by the Niji as their official language. It is a slang derivative of certain words already spoken. So, according to this article, linguists were trying to figure out whether the English language spoken in Southeastern America was more Creole-like, or was it more like languages spoken in Africa, with them bearing the term African Americans. But what they realized was that the language was not like the African languages at all. So by default, it had to be more Creole. And even though the base of it was less like Creole in terms of wording and structure, they still labeled it as Creole. It is a Creole language with the justification that somehow over time it lost its Creole roots. Henceforth the introduction of the term decreolization, meaning that it's actually not Creole at all. Statistically, many of the places that have been colonized by European influence through a sudden immigration of Europeans, which include British, German, French, and the Dutch, along with any of their closely related family members, have over the years transported themselves into whatever countries they could reach by sea, which includes the United States, Canada, Australia, the Caribbean islands, Pacific islands, South Africa, and pretty much any land which they were able to sail to, which allowed them to eventually immigrate. And then if allowed further, they migrated inward, trying to make English the first language of choice over any other language already present within these lands. This was in order to conduct business or trade, and each location eventually has its own dialect of English, as the first order of conquest always lies in communication and changing the language. English creates an angle of entry, taking any words already present and aligning them in a braided structure that, when spoken repeatedly, causes more harm than good. Regardless of what was thought to be intended, what is spoken is usually meant for the downfall of the person speaking the English language. Why is this so? The word English broken in two by sound gives you Ing-lish, and the etymology of ing is synonymous with ing and ang. The Middle English Dictionary places ing with ing and hang. The Oxford English Dictionary states that hang is a derivative of hang, and lish is a derivative of leash. So ultimately you get the true definition of English, which is a hang leash. It is something that can be used to tie or suspend the throat, to have control over, to keep in bondage. Now, the question is, why would someone go through all of this trouble to hide the true definitions and change the spelling of words? And where does this even come from? According to the Noah Webster Education Foundation, Noah Webster Jr., born October 16, 1758, is widely known as the father of America's scholarship and education. He came of age during the time of the American Revolution. He was a strong supporter of the Constitutional Convention and dedicated his life to causes he believed would make a stronger nation. Noah Webster believed in the developing culture and independence of the United States. He thought that a distinctive American language was important to the success of the Union. His first effort to help with the unifying language was a compendious dictionary of the English language, the first truly American dictionary, which he published in 1806. He then expanded that effort by learning 26 different languages, reflecting the languages of ethnic communities found in the United States. And in 1828, he published an American dictionary of the English language. Did you hear that? It said that he then expanded that effort by learning 26 different languages, reflecting the languages of ethnic communities found in the United States. Who do you think they're referring to here? It continues on by saying, in addition to helping shape the language usage of early Americans, right after that, Noah Webster was an education reformer and the author of several textbooks. He believed in the importance that citizens in the various states would have the opportunity to learn and acquire a similar knowledge base, creating a competitive advantage for all. End quote. Keep in mind that Noah Webster was executing all of his works during the time where citizenship was not available to the needy. So it is critical to grasp exactly what is meant here in regard to Noah Webster wanting the citizens in various states to have a competitive advantage. The Noah Webster Education Foundation goes on to say, while Webster published several successful textbooks, one of the most used was a Grammatical Institute of the English Language, otherwise known as the Blueback Speller, in 1783. It became the staple for teaching children for well over a century and was central to the education of several generations of early Americans. Benjamin Franklin reportedly taught his granddaughter to read, spell, and pronounce words using Old Blueback. This work by Webster is credited with helping to build the most literate nation in the history of the West. Webster's focus on education emphasized the fundamental pillars of learning and knowledge. In time, those pillars became widely known as the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic, now known as reading, writing, and arithmetic. The common understanding was that students who grasped these basic disciplines well would have the tools they needed to learn everything else required for their success in life. End quote. Noah Webster made multiple decisions detailing which words should be used in everyday language, all the way down to pinpointing exactly how they should be spelled. Why was spelling so important to the extent that many words that were around before Noah Webster's books, words well known by adults already, were decidedly changed? This gives power to the creator of such a thing, especially when dealing with children, as he advocated for a national language to be taught in schools, which would allow certain words to be used over others. Yeah, see, it is my hope that many people will comprehend the seriousness of such a matter. In fact, here's an example of how improper wording may cause detriment. In the final sentence quoted by the Noah Webster Education Foundation, it says, quote, "The common understanding was that students who grasped these basic disciplines well would have the tools they needed to learn anything else required for their success in life." Why was the word learn taught to be used when describing a way to gain knowledge versus the term apprendre, as in apprentice? The French term for learning is apprendre. The Spanish term is aprende. Instead, in America, we are taught to learn and comprehend, which means to lose something, to give a person something free of charge, like land in this sense, and everything else in between. Now, as we revisit the question, why would someone go through all of this trouble to hide the true definitions and the spelling of words? And where does this even come from? Well, the saying is, if you give someone enough rope, they'll hang themselves. And that is exactly what the words of the English language have done.
I'm just here to make you think.